Thank you, choir. That's wonderful. Good morning. My name's Mike. I'm one of the pastors. Thanks for worshiping with us today. Whether you're here or online, whether you're online now, online later, however you are worshiping, it's great to be with you all. Today we're beginning a new conversation. I'll tell you about it in a second, but I want to begin by asking a question. Who's your favorite superhero? And actually, I want, if you're online, I want you to vote with us online. Put a comment. I'm curious. By applause if you're in the room, applause if you're online, but I can't hear that. So, who's a Superman fan? Anybody? There's some. Who's Wonder Woman? I don't know, it's pretty close. Maybe Wonder Woman by a hair. Let's try this one. Who's Captain Marvel? Anybody? Okay. Who's Black Panther? I think Black Panther won that round. Maybe we need to change the genres. Who's James T. Kirk? Captain Kirk? There's several. Jean-Luc Picard fans? I think we skew a little Kirk. What about the original Skywalker, Luke? There you go. Who is a Rey, the last Skywalker? Who's a Rey fan? No, nobody. You'll need to watch. It's a good movie, by the way. I will go different. This isn't Baby Yoda. It's Grogu. Grogu fans? The Mandalorian? That's right. And everybody, Jar Jar? I actually was surprised Jar Jar got a single clap. I just don't get it. Well, let's try like a very controversial one. Let's see. Taylor Swifties. Kelsey. By the way, do they have like a combined name yet? Kelsey, Swifty? I don't know. All right. I thought about it. We can do this all day, by the way. I thought about doing Cubs, Cardinals, but I figured if we did that, everybody'd be miserable. So thankfully that season's gone. Let's go Blues, although I'm not sure that's any better. Today we're kicking off a brand new sermon series talking about everyday heroes. And if you're here a year ago, by the way, I wasn't, I'm new. I know every week we have new people worshiping with us. If we haven't had a chance to meet, I'd love to meet you after worship and just say hi. But last year, if you're here, we did a sermon series called Everyday Heroes. We also did a campaign for some work around our facility and grounds. We'll give you an update about that next week. We're going to celebrate that. But we're going to revisit this theme over the next several weeks. And we're going to talk about some people that are the most unlikely heroes and yet make an extraordinary impact in an everyday sort of way. So I'm excited about this sermon series. I want to begin by just helping us think through a general question. What makes a hero a hero? Have you thought about that? If you're online, I'd love to hear your comments. We have over 100 people who worship online every single week, so I'd love to hear. What I know is I'll get whatever I put into something. So those of you who are kind of passive worshipers, you'll get more if you try to engage a little bit more. I'd encourage you to do that if you're online. So post a comment. But those of us in the room here, what makes a hero a hero? I'd love to hear a few thoughts. Somebody who does extraordinary things. Somebody about going above and beyond. Helping others. Virtuous, self-sacrifice. Doing the unexpected, going for what's right. Yeah, those are all great. Y'all are far too churchy for me. I think about like a cape. I should have brought one. Did anybody as a kid remember like you take that towel and you tie it around your neck and instantly you felt like a superhero? Anybody else? You know that? You know, I'm far less churchy than you all, so I think about the ones we see on the screen, except for like Swifty and Kelsey, although, I'm a fan of that too. No, I think about it, but I think it was probably about 4 years ago that just my heart moved to seeing heroes differently. Let me show you a quick video that changed my perspective. Does anybody remember this? This is in the middle of COVID. It was actually at the beginning of COVID, New York City. The streets were empty. Now remember, COVID's on an uptick. I'll do more fist bumping, and we know more today than we did 3-4 years ago. But 3-4 years ago, we didn't know anything, except there was a global pandemic. And in the middle of that, there's people who risk themselves, who risk their families, who went to work in the hospitals. And the crowds of people would cheer from their balconies, and they would call them heroes, these healthcare workers, and so many other people that boldly went where nobody had gone before. Do you remember that? And I remember that being a defining moment for me about, like, what makes a hero a hero? And I'm thinking about that. And then I started thinking about the next question. What would it take for you to be called a hero? What would it take for me? Is there anybody in your life that might call you a hero? Or what would it take for somebody in your life to think of you as a hero? I want to reflect on that today as we look at, I think, an incredibly unlikely hero. In fact, I think even in the moment this story happened, there was probably very few people, maybe outside of Jesus, who really understood what was going on. It was, we're going to read through it. We're going to talk about it along the way. It's a really interesting story, but maybe a story that some of us, maybe we're like, oh yeah, I remember that, but we wouldn't initially think of this as a story of a hero. But interestingly enough, we have 4 biographies of Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and John were eyewitnesses. Luke heard about it secondhand, and he was a researcher that put together his biography. But all 4 of them included this story, which is important because there's only 11 stories which were included in all 4 biographies of Jesus' life. So think about that. If you're to write a story of Jesus' life, and 3 years, all the incredible miracles, all the incredible stories, all the incredible things, and you are choosing, like, what's the handful that you're going to write about? This is one of them that made all 4 versions, which I think is important for us to know, okay? I want you to hear this story this is Matthew's telling. This comes from Matthew 26. It's later in Jesus' ministry. He'd been going towards Jerusalem, and he's visiting a town that's kind of a suburb of Jerusalem. When Jesus was at Bethany, that's the town, and Jesus would spend several times there, had a group of friends there. When Jesus was at Bethany visiting the house of Simon, who had a skin disease. Other translations call this Simon the leper. A woman came to Jesus with a vase made of alabaster. Do any of you have any alabaster? It's like this beautiful, precious stone that they can make vases out of. And so this alabaster vase, containing very expensive perfume. And she poured it on Jesus' head while he was sitting at dinner. Now I want to stop right here. So there's 4 biographies of Jesus' life, and each of them tell it a little bit different. So Matthew and Mark say the woman poured the oil on Jesus' head. Luke and John say that she poured it on his feet. And some people have said maybe those are different stories. Probably not, because of so many similarities. But if you're like, how could it be the 2 different things? So picture this for a second. They don't, it's at night, or at least dusk. They don't have any street lights. They don't have any electricity. They don't have any lights inside this crowded home. They have a lot of people, and the only thing you have is like candlelight, So you can imagine it's dark. There's a lot of people. There's different things going on. There's different conversations. The tables aren't like a chair like we would think of in a big table. It's like knee-sized tables. So people are sitting on the ground. I'm not going to do that because I wouldn't embarrass both of us that way. But they're sitting on the ground. Some people have suggested maybe Jesus' feet was like he was sitting on them behind him. And there's all sorts of ways to interpret it. But most importantly, different people see different things, right? We know this from eyewitness accounts. Like you'll ask all of us about an event, ask everybody like, what did you think of Pastor Mike's sermon? And you all will hear very different things. We hear things differently, which I think adds to the beauty of the four Gospels because they tell us four different perspectives that help maybe give us a glimpse into the real story. And so Matthew talks about it coming on his head. The other thing that Luke tells us and John really tells us, I'm trying to remember if Luke or Mark tells us, is that this woman is very emotional. In fact, two of the stories tell us that her tears were so powerful that they begin to wash Jesus' feet with her tears. One of the Gospels says she dries Jesus' feet with her hair. And so if you've ever been around like a very emotional, powerful experience where somebody's having a very emotional experience, I don't know about you, this is me. I like back off a little because the emotions are so raw. I find it a little intimidating. So I can imagine like some of the other disciples like, what's going on, and pulling back a little. You get the picture? So there's this woman who has this very profound emotional experience, who's anointing Jesus with this very expensive oil. Now, when the disciples saw this, let me start that. Now, when the disciples saw it, they were angry, which is an interesting, and said, "Why this waste? This perfume could have been sold for a lot of money and given it to the poor." So let's go back, four tellings. So Matthew tells us a lot of people. By the way, you know, when people come to me and say, "Pastor Mike, a lot of people are saying," I'll just tell you, if you come to me, I'll say, "Who?" Because usually like a lot of people are like me and my two coffee buddies, and that's a lot of people. I actually have a feeling this as we read the other four. Matthew's like, a lot of people are upset. Now Mark says, by the way, one more thing. Matthew, does anybody remember his job? He was a tax collector. So that tells us something about his experience and his relationship with money, right? That's important to note. So Matthew, a lot of people are really upset about this expensive perfume that was being used. Mark says some people. He doesn't say a lot of people. He's like, I don't know. There's a few people, some people that were upset. Like, you can tell Mark's experiences this differently, right? Luke, who wasn't there but hears about it years later, doesn't even mention anybody being upset. In fact, the only thing Luke tells us is a perfume is worth about a year's wages, which I thought is interesting. So this woman, an average person's year's wage, whatever you think that is, and that's how much the perfume was. And then John, anybody know what John says? John says that Judas is angry, which I think is interesting. In fact, Judas, right after this story, then goes to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, which is far less money than this perfume is worth. So, get the picture. Matthew says everyone's angry. Mark's like, a few people. Luke's like, somebody's angry? And John's like, it's Judas. So we have to put the pieces together. I'll just tell you you can read it differently, but I'll tell you what I think. I think it tells you something about your relationship with money, right? My guess is that Matthew, who's like an accountant, right, who deals with money a lot. There's some of us that are Matthew. I'm kind of that Matthew person, right? I keep track of all our finances on Quicken. I keep track of it. I reconcile the bank accounts. I check receipts. There's some of you like that, right? And then there's some of you are like, reconcile what? You're like, I know how much money's in the bank because I look at it online or go to the ATM and check, right? So we see different stories, but I get the picture that Matthew, who's very concerned with money, and Judas, well, we know the story. If you don't know the story of Judas, Judas is the one who betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. So you can tell money's important for him as well. So I kind of figure Matthew and Judas are really angry, and maybe a couple of other people, randos, maybe one other disciple we don't know about, but they're angry. And the rest of the disciples are like, that's the thing, right? I don't know how you read it, but that's how I read it. But I think this is important because in this moment, we see something about their relationship with money that I think I want to ask you about. How do you feel about money as you hear this story? Each of us has our own money story, right? Some of us get super anxious whenever, our marriages, you're talking about money is one of the most stressful things in a relationship. Some of you worry about it. Some of you are like, I don't care. It's easy going. But I think in this story is we see a reflection of how they perceive it, and specifically how they perceive generosity, how they perceive giving to others. Because there's some of us who giving to others, doing things extravagant, being generous is very easy. And there's some of that that's very hard for many of us. In fact, this is a generalization. I've only been here a few months, but I've been a pastor for 25 years. One of the things I've heard over 25 years is the people who complain, at least in the church, about spending the most, the people who complain about spending, the people like Matthew and Judas who are critiquing this jar of perfume, are typically the people who give the least. It's interesting. And the people who give the most, typically, they can be very careful about their own money. They oftentimes very strategic. But the people who give the most, and I don't mean the most dollars, but I mean the biggest percentage, they tend to be the ones who don't care as much about how the church uses their money. They actually emphasize how giving impacts their life rather than what they give to. And I think that's important because generosity is more about our heart than it is what we give to. Generosity, think of it this way. Generosity is much more about a mirror than it is a window. You know the difference, right? The window looks at something else, what we're giving to, where we're going. The mirror tells us about ourselves. When it comes to this woman and how Matthew perceives it and Judas perceives it versus other people perceive it and how Jesus perceives it, is a lot more about their heart than it is the dollar amount. You know how I know this? It's the same amount of money for all the people, right? It's a big amount of money for everybody in the room. But how they experience this act is very different, and that tells them something about their own heart. Jesus talks a lot about this. So there's a parable Jesus tells about day laborers, which he actually challenges his followers to think about their relationship with money. Do you know what day laborers are? People who go out, down in the South, they have this a lot more. If you ever go to a Home Depot or a Lowe's or in the morning, there's people just looking for a day's work. And farmers will come out and they'll say, hey, who needs a job? I need 5 people. So Jesus tells a very similar story. A landowner goes out at 6 a.m. And hires some people to do a day's work in their vineyard. And so it says, I'll pay you a day's wage. They hop in the truck. they go to the vineyard. The landowner comes back at 9 a.m., which, by the way, if I'm going to work, I'm not a 6 a.m. person. Some of you are the 6 a.m. I'm I show up to the church at 9 a.m. That's me. That's my type of people. So 9 a.m., hey, some of you want a job for the day? Sure, I'll give you a day's wage. Come on. So they go to the fields. The landowner then goes back at noon and finds some other people still looking for a day's work. Hey, you want a job? I'll give you a job. Come on with me. And at noon, they start working. And he goes again at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he hires some more people to work in the fields. So 5 o'clock hits. He's like, all right, done for a day. Come on. So he starts giving their pay, and he starts with the people who started working at 3 o'clock, and he pays them a day's wage. Then he pays the people at noon a day's wage, the same amount. And he pays the people at 9 a.m. a day's wage. And he pays the people who started at 6 a.m. a day's wage. Now here's a question. If you've been working since 6 a.m., come on, that's a little cray. If you've been working since 9 a.m., how would you feel? Anybody feel like, wait, didn't I work more? Shouldn't I get paid more? Anybody feel that way? So they begin to say to the landowner, like, hey, we got paid the same, but we did more work. And the landowner says this, didn't I pay you what I agreed to pay you? Whenever I hired you, didn't I pay you what we agreed on? They're like, yeah, but that's not fair. And then I love what the landowner says. Jesus responds with this phrase, are you resentful because I'm generous? And it's a twist on the story because what they're thinking about is their work, right? Themselves. They're thinking about themselves. But what Jesus says is the person who's in charge of whose possessions it is, the source of it, they're the ones who get to decide how they're going to spend it, right? Are you resentful because I'm generous? Now, I wonder if when this woman is pouring perfume on Jesus' head and feet and having this powerful emotion, and you have Matthew and Judas that are just kind of angry about how this woman's using her money. By the way, is it Matthew and Judas's money? No. Whose money is it? The woman's. The woman who probably more than likely didn't have a job. This might have been the single most expensive item she's ever owned in her life. She's been saving it up her entire life for something sacred, so special and holy. This is a year's wages for the common person, and women in that society couldn't even begin to make that. And I wonder if Jesus looked at Judas and Matthew and thought, are you resentful because this woman is generous? Because that's what's going on in their heart, right? I hear this oftentimes when it comes to buildings in churches. Now, I wasn't here when the church was built. It's 20 years ago, actually. 20 years ago, we moved to this location. 20 years ago, I was a young pastor. I was 25 years ago, I was at two churches in DeSoto, and sometime in those first couple of years, I came to Church of the Shepherd. And we were over on McClay, which is now where the Catholic Charities is, if you're curious. We're over on McClay. We had a building there. I remember visiting your pastor then. His name is now Bishop Farr. Back then it was Reverend Farr, or many of you just called him Bob. Today we call him Bishop. So Bishop was your pastor, and I remember talking to him as a young pastor with a group of other pastors, and he talked about this vision to move from McClay to Woodstone. And I don't even remember if they had the property, but he began to describe their vision, who they were called to be, and he began to talk about what that was like. In fact, we put together a little video to honor that 20th building. Let's go ahead and play that video for us.
Well, I'm Bishop Bob Farr. As most people at Church of the Shepherd would know, me as Bob Farr. I was pastor there from 2000 to 2008. First off, we were full at the McClay site in terms of worship space, and we're doing multiple services trying to have everybody there. Secondly, we were struggling with the building, just not configured very well. Having lots of maintenance issues. Probably third, if you go by where the old McClay site was, it was not, it was a neighborhood church. It was not very visible.
It was getting too crowded. We needed a lot more room than what we had. So that's basically why we started looking. And of course, we wanted a sanctuary, but we couldn't afford it to start with. So consequently, we have what we have now. And that's worked out well for us, I think.
Quite frankly, we had a meeting and decided we just about had given up, that we just simply couldn't afford to move out to a more visible site. And Russ Lawson, you probably know Russ, I don't know how this happened, suggested we go out and stand on the property of the Woodstone property. At that point, there was nothing there but the post office.
Bishop Farr came up beside me and he says, "What do you think?" And I says, "I think we found our spot for our church." I says, "We're on a hill. 94 runs down there. People is going to see us up here in this hill. And that's what we want to be. We want to be seen, because over in McClade, we kind of had to go there on purpose to find it. And we just decided at the committee then, we voted on, and this is where we decided to build our church.
I'll never forget Russ Lawson looking out over the hill and seeing all the rooftops at the time, which is about half of the rooftops you have now, and saying, "Look at that, look at those rooftops, look at that mission field." And looking at me and said, "This is where we need to be."
We were hoping, and I think everybody was thinking the same thing, that we could be for the community. We was here for the community. We wanted to be out and help different organizations or help different people, and I think we've done that. I mean, we've done some amazing things at this church that I think I'm very proud of they're doing anyway.
The first time we worshiped, I just remember it was just such a wonderful, joyous time. Of course, you know, a lot of dignitaries were here and everything, but everybody was just so forward-thinking and so excited about our future.
Oh, I'm proud of Church of the Shepherd. It's good work it's done. It's mission work in the community, and it's faithfulness in the United Methodist Church. It is a place, always has been a place where anybody and all people could come, and that they welcomed all walks of life, and just it was a welcoming community for anybody and everybody, with really no asterisk, no quorums. If you stepped in the building, they welcome you, and formal, informal, just whatever your lifestyle. I mean, it was just a church that welcomed all people, and I think still is, and that's I'm proud of Church of Shepherd. Every time I go by it, I think that was some of our best times in our ministry.
How many of you, I know many of us are newbies like me. By the way, if you've been here 15 years, if you've been here 15 weeks, you're not a newbie. But not all of us have been here 20 years. But if you were here whenever we moved from McClay and moved to this location, Woodstone, just raise your hand. I'm just going to look around. Thank you. Let's give them a hand. If you're online and you were here as a part of that move, worshiping with us, I hope you'll just say, "I was here" in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And maybe we don't always get to see you. We would love to honor you. I'm so grateful for so many people that sacrificed and worked and gave generously in order to make space. I think about that whenever I come into worship spaces. You know, I'm almost always been new to the space, but I'm always mindful whenever I sit in a chair, somebody gave so that I could have a place to sit and experience God's grace and worship. Somebody gave so that I have, a roof and walls and lights and sound and all that stuff. And somebody gave so that we can have heating and air conditioning. We never think about heating and air conditioning, right? You never think about it until when? It's broken, right? Until it's not working. And then you're like, oh my gosh. You know, think about people that gave for so many things that we just take for granted. I actually wonder if in this moment that this woman gave so generously something so precious, in that moment, people would have no idea that this story would be so profound that her faith, her generosity, her gift would continue to make an impact thousands of years later in people's lives. I want to continue with this story. Verse 10, but Jesus knew what they were thinking. By the way, I don't think that's because Jesus was God, but while he was on earth, he actually was fully human. So it's not like he was reading their minds. I think he just saw when this woman was doing it, he looked over and saw Judas and Matthew being like, and you kind of get the idea like, oh, they're angry. Think he knew what they're thinking. And Jesus said, why do you make trouble for this woman? What do you think he's talking about? Why are you concerned about this woman's generosity more than your own heart? Why are you make trouble for this woman? She's done a good thing for me. Now, you're always going to have poor with you. By the way, Jesus wasn't justifying like poverty is good, we shouldn't care. It's completely different. In fact, I would argue sometimes when churches move, I obviously wasn't here, but when churches like do building things, I always hear over 25 years, not here, but like, well, we could use that money for helping poor people. Yes and no. Here's the yeah. Yes, we could, although we would never be able to give as much away because people are motivated about giving something that makes a future impact more than a short-term impact. Meaning they'll give more for something that's going to make a 20-year impact. And I would argue that we can give more to help the poor because we moved to Woodstone, because we're the church that we are today, because we're a church that has had such a tradition and impact over the past 20 years, and the next 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years, right? Long after we're gone and forgotten, that this ministry, this legacy is going to continue to make an impact. So Jesus wasn't justifying poverty is okay. Rather, he's talking about the practical implications. You're right, you could do that, but you're always going to have poverty among you. You won't always have Jesus. By pouring this perfume over my body, she's preparing me to be buried. And I tell you the truth, wherever in the whole world this good news is announced, that's, by the way, gospel. Whenever in the whole world the story of Jesus' life is told, all four versions, what she's done will also be told in memory of her. And think about this. A woman who out of her poverty, a woman who's on the margins of society, we hear that in Luke's version, a woman who just had everything against her, a woman who was willing to do something so profound like give this perfume, it's expensive perfume, has made a tremendous impact. I started by asking the question, like, what makes a hero a hero? To me, I would call this woman a hero by virtue of the fact that her story is told thousands of years later in a way that inspires us to live and love more like Jesus taught us to live and love. So once again, I'm going to ask for a little audience participation. If you're online, comment. What makes this woman a hero? Sacrifice? Doing the unexpected? Her faith? Give what she could? Yeah, give what she could that might have been so great to others. Yeah. Courage. I love it. She was generous even when she didn't have it. Yeah. I love this story of how, here's what I notice in all this. She did what she could to make a difference in somebody else's life. And because of that, she became a hero. Now, here's what I want to ask you. The other question earlier. Is there anybody in your life that would call you a hero? Or what would it take for somebody to call you a hero? Is there a simple act of faith, a willingness to live differently, to live courageously, to live boldly? Maybe something this week, and it's not a question for you to answer this morning, but I hope it's a question that tugs at your heart all week long. Can I pray for us? God, thank you for this woman's story, for this woman's faith that in the moment may not have made sense, and yet thousands of years later continues to inspire us and invite us to live the life that you created us to, live the life that honors you, live the life that Jesus came to show us. Help us to live boldly, help us to live courageously, help us to live generously, help us to live in love like you invite us to. God, I pray, and you know every single thoughts in every single one of us, and every single one of us are thinking about different things right now. But help us to hear your voice, know your presence, to take that single act of faith this week, whatever that looks like, to live and love in a way that makes a difference in somebody else's life. In your name, we pray. Amen? Amen.